Episode 16, AD 1238 to 1291. The way things turn out. Great historical outcomes are often the result of the collision between human intentions and the irresistible force of accident. In the year 1241, the destiny of Europe, for a brief moment, appeared to be taking a gigantic turn, for it was on the verge of becoming an outpost of the Mongol Empire. In this episode, then, we will start with the East, the lands and peoples assimilated to Latin Christendom between the 960s and 1000 AD. In the frame particularly are the aristocratic political communities of Poland, Hungary, Denmark and Sweden. Since the 19th century's nationalist rewriting of European history, Poles and Hungarians have been taught to believe that their ever-existing nations in this period were torn apart by selfish, unnationally minded barons, and that the so-called state of Poland or of Hungary was dismembered and left vulnerable to foreign aggression. This is typical of the nationalist paradigm of history. But we know from the previous episodes that there was nothing like a state in existence during these centuries. Indeed, this or that dynasty, the Piasts in Poland or the Arapads in Hungary, held together, through their sacral prestige, coalitions of largely independent local lords in unstable and volatile feudal political formations, just as was the case across Latin Christendom. That this was so is the measure of these groups' religious, cultural and political assimilation and acculturation to the mentality and way of life of Occidental Christian civilization. The claimed dismemberment of these kingdoms was part of the normal development of any medieval polity. In both these lands, the institution of kingship had been imported from the Latin Occident. In Poland, the recognition of one of the leading warlords as Duke had been given by the Western Roman Emperor, who spoke German, to Mieszko I, and Emperor Otto II and Pope Sylvester acted to bestow an archbishopric on Gniezno, in effect raising the Polish lands to the level of a recognized Occidental kingdom. By the late 1100s, the great baronial magnates had gained effective independence for their principalities, under the symbolic suzerainty of one of their own number, the Dukes of Krakow. Similarly, in Hungary, the Arapad dynasty had, by the time of King Andras II, King Andreas, had to concede the rights and privileges of the greater and lesser aristocracies in a golden bull, the Oranje bull. This famously included a specific clause of legitimation of the jus resistendi, the right to resist, that the bishops and magnates, should a future king be deemed to break the terms of the charter, be acting untreasonably if they took up arms against his power. From 1222 onwards, the Hungarian kings had to swear to uphold the terms of this charter. We have seen in the previous episode how such charters were at this time being used to resolve conflicts between the dynastic princely power and the still very real regional powers and independence of the great families of the realm. In England, in Aragon, Castile and Navarre and elsewhere, the explicit legal limitation of regnal power was by the late 1200s commonplace. The political issue was, under these conditions, to what extent could a medieval king maintain the support and unity of his senior clients and power holders. These Latin Christian political communities, situated on the eastern rim of the West, faced out across the Great Plains towards a complex and shifting world. The most stable and influential entity to their east was the Principality of Kiev. At this time, what we think of as Russia was not even a concept in someone's mind. An East Slavic-speaking political community had formed around the city of Kiev on the river Dnieper, flowing down to the Black Sea, and thereby connecting it to the Roman Empire at Constantinople. The Kievans had besieged Constantinople in the 860s. Over the following century, the Kievans underwent the typical process of Christianization without conquest. There were repeated baptisms of the leading families and reversals to paganism in subsequent power struggles. But the great fact of this process remained that Kiev's primary exposure to Christianity was that of the Caesaro-Papist ecclesiastical style and form then existing at Constantinople, and not at Rome. Kiev, the most civilized part of this vast region, duly influenced the petty principalities in the forested north, those of Vladimir, Volhynia, Novgorod, etc. These too, slowly over time, became Christianized following the Eastern Mediterranean model, with monasteries being implanted as centers of culture in these remote regions, and metropolitan bishops taking a leading role in the immediate circles of the local princes. In the northwest, along the Baltic, lay the great pagan principality of Lithuania, which was in its own right a formidable power. Along the rim of the Baltic, from recently Christianizing Pomerania all the way around to the Gulf of Sweden, lived Slavic and Baltic tribes of various ethnicities and language groups, following their primordial pagan religious cults. On the cusp of the 1200s, Pope Innocent III sponsored a crusade to convert the pagans of the northern sea, the Baltic. Albertus, Albrecht von Buxtehude, from a great family of Saxony near Hanover, was appointed bishop and military leader of a large force which arrived in Livonia in 1199. Together with other interests, he founded the settlement of Riga in 1201, erecting a wooden palisaded town. By 1211 he had erected a church, the Riga Dom, which, though completely built over, still stands in the same spot today. This was the arrival of Christianity in the Baltic, accompanied by a very formidable military escort, numbering thousands. It took 3 decades to completely subdue the Livonians and render them passive recipients of the Christian message and its Frankish way of living. To make the crusading presence permanent, crusaders normally went home, Albertus formed an order of canon knights, the Fratres Militiae Christi Livoniae, the Brothers of the Militia of Christ of Livonia, known to us by the term Schwertbrüderorden, Order of the Sword Brothers, a much more sensational title. These were bloodily defeated by the pagan tribesmen in 1236, whereafter they were absorbed into the more substantial military infrastructures of the Teutonic Order, more properly known as the Ordo Domus Sanctae Mariae Teutonicorum Hierosolymitanorum, that is, Order of the House of Holy Mary of the Germans at Jerusalem. This was a religiously motivated, as well as a territorially motivated enterprise, as were the contemporary crusades in Al-Andalus and in the Holy Land. Participants at the time did not see any contradiction in these twin goals, a contradiction that we find to be so glaring. This is one of the measures of the moral distance that has been covered through the subsequent 800 years of European history. The same combination was at work on the northern shores of the Baltic. In 1219, King Valdemar II of Denmark obtained the crusading indulgence from Pope Honorius III and led a very large fleet across the Baltic to what is now Estonia. At a great battle on June 15th of 1219, his camp was attacked by the Esti tribesmen and was nearly overwhelmed. It is reported that Bishop Sunesen, Andreas Sunonis in Latin, a graduate of the University of Paris and Bologna, saw a red crusading banner with a white cross fall from heaven and gave it to the struggling Danish knights, who completely defeated the Ests, causing great slaughter. This has been the flag of Denmark ever since 1219, called Den Dannebrog, which you can see fluttering in suburban gardens all over Denmark today, a beloved symbol of identity and security for Danes, detached now from its bloody crusading original meaning. Likewise, the Swedish warrior nobility were restless with religious and territorial ambition in the mid-1200s. In 1209, Pope Innocent III authorized the establishment of a bishopric in southwestern Finland at Turku. It had an Englishman, Thomas, as its bishop from 1220 to 1245. In 1240, the Jarl Birger of Sweden, a vassal of King Eric XI, led a crusade against the city of Novgorod, but was defeated by Alexander Nevsky. In 1249, the same Birger led another crusade into southwestern Finland and established Swedish hegemony over the Finns. In 1293, a crusade into Karelia resulted in the building of the Swedish citadel of Vyborg, now within the borders of Russia. Finland remained an integral part of the Swedish crown. It was not referred to in documents as Finland until the 1500s. Swedish was the language of the court and of the literate classes. From that time on, the Finns began the long, slow process of becoming acculturated to the way of life and outlook of Latin Christendom, and remain a vibrant component of the Europe of today. In 1226, the Polish Duke Conrad of the Principality of Mazovia, under serious threat from the pagan tribes to his north, sought the aid of the Teutonic Knights to conquer the Prussians of the South Baltic. The Ordenrittern came in force, and they came to stay. They spent the next 6 decades subduing the Prussians and extending their dominion through the absorption of the Sword Brothers into Livonia and beyond. Most strikingly, from our point of view, they established a unique form of political structure in these lands called an Ordensstaat in German, a true political and territorial domain operated and administered centrally by the religio-military order of the knights themselves. The Grand Master of the order held the seigneurie over Prussia and the Courland, that is Livonia, just as the King of Aragon or of England held it over their dominions. The difference was that the knights of the order of Our Lady of Jerusalem were celibate and not subject to the same confusions and internecine power struggles of a secular and intermarried regnal family. Militarily, the heavily armoured cavalry shock tactics of the Westerners more often than not defeated the masked tribesmen, but not always. It is reported that at least on one occasion that the Livs made a point of roasting a captured Western knight in his metal cuirass, to relish the defeat of armour they didn't have. The order was repulsed in 1242 when it attempted to subject Novgorod to its control. They were defeated by the Prince of Vladimir, Alexander Nevsky, who had previously defeated the Swedes. The small principalities of northern Russia did not become a subdued part of Latin Christendom, and later fully fledged European regions, as the Baltic states are today. For a great storm arose far to the east, one which no one could have foretold, and which changed almost everything. Deep in Mongolia, in an unimaginably different form of society, the extremely nomadic, yurt-dwelling and yak-herding Mongols suddenly resolved their interminable tribal feuding when a successful and completely ruthless war leader arose among them. As had happened 6 centuries before in the Arabian Peninsula, nomads, when suddenly united, can form a most formidable, indeed virtually unstoppable, war machine when all the tribesmen, hardened and endued to warfare, are mobilized to a single enterprise of conquest. Interestingly, in the case of the Mongols, who were shamanists of a most archaic kind, religion played only a very minor role in this mobilization. The spirit of solidarity and elan around the successful war leader operated with a snowballing effect. A few critical early victories gathered sufficient prestige and authority to attract quite enormous numbers to join his undertakings. This leader was Genghis, later to be crowned Khan, Genghis Khan. It is not our purpose to trace the explosive, self-reinforcing expansion of the Mongol Empire. The story has been often told. This had been seen before and achieved with very similar means by similar people. In the 400s AD, the Hunni of Attila had conquered all before them, with a mounted, arrow-firing horde, briefly dominating a vast expanse of Eurasia. Attila had gone as far as Orleans in France. Genghis and his sons and grandsons conquered China and Korea, all of Central Asia and Russia, the Middle East as far as Egypt, and had attempted to take Japan and had attempted to take Europe itself. Armies and long-established political structures fell before them like mowed grass. The nomadic Mongols soon adopted all the sophisticated siege equipment and techniques, the armour and the logistical methods of their more civilized victims. The son of Genghis, Batu, guided by Subutai, crossed the Volga in 1236 and conquered the local South Russian princes and scattered the nomadic Cumans of the steppelands of South Russia. In a few years, 1238 to 1239, they swept north through what we now know as Russia, killing everyone and burning everything in their path. They took Ryazan, Moscow, Vladimir, and all the settlements of the northern principalities, too many to mention. In 1240 they took and sacked the greatest city of the whole region and centre of the most settled power and fullest culture, Kiev. Then they rested. The princes of the north fled before their arrival, realizing, as they say, that resistance was futile. The Russian princes came to them in their vast encampments to prostrate themselves before the Mongol lords. Some of them went much further, including the previously victorious Prince of Vladimir, Alexander Nevsky, who travelled all the way to deepest Mongolia, to the capital of the Mongol Empire at Karakorum, built by Chinese and Muslim craftsmen. Alexander Nevsky, iconic hero of modern Russian nationalism, became, along with the other northern Russian princes, the overt agents in their principalities of the Khans of the Zolotaya Orda, the Golden Horde, extracting the tribute money each year and seeing that it was faithfully and honourably presented to the Khans in their golden pavilions at Sarai on the lower Volga. Indeed, Guyuk Khan, on receiving the supplications of Alexander Nevsky at Karakorum in 1248, appointed him Prince of Kiev. When Novgorod rose up in rebellion against the Mongols' census and consequent crippling taxation, Nevsky took an army north to suppress them. The city and country he had saved from the Swedes and from the Sword Brothers, he himself reconquered for the Mongols. From the Chinese-style pavilions of Karakorum, the mind of the great Khan, Genghis' son Udegai, could turn as easily to conceive the conquest of Japan as he could that of Europe, as far as the great ocean, as the Mongols said. The orders were issued to his grandsons, Baidar and Kaidu, ably advised and assisted by the great general Subutai, then with a horde resting in southern Ukraine. Latin Christendom was about to be confronted with a power based in the Far East that had wiped out the great powers of China, Iran, and the Muslim Middle East. They had no idea of the nature of what was coming. In March 1241, 3 Mongol armies descended upon Poland and Hungary. The King of Hungary, Bela IV, and Boleslav, Duke of Krakow, summoned their respective feudal liege lords and came out to meet them. Baidar defeated the Polish forces under Duke Boleslav on March 3rd, and another Christian army at Chmielnik 2 weeks later. Turning back to Krakow, the Mongols took and burned the city on March 24th. They then assaulted the Silesian capital Breslau, but Breslau was better fortified and held out. On the open plain near Liegnitz, the Mongol force was confronted by the assembled feudal host of Henry of Silesia. The Teutonic Knights were there, under their Grand Master Popo, as were the Templars of the region, and the princes of various Polish principalities. They were annihilated by the showers of armour-piercing arrows, fired from horseback in the classic steppe tactic of fire and withdraw. The European heavy cavalry, once it had charged, couldn't catch the small but swift Mongolian ponies, and found themselves isolated from their main formations, and were cut down with arrow and scimitar. It had happened so many times before. The Mongols, whom the Europeans called the Tartars, Tartary blended with the classical name for hell, Tartarus, cut off the ears of their victims and collected 9 sacks full. Approximately 25,000 lives had been taken. Liegnitz was but a warm-up for the forces of Baidar. On the same day that this slaughter was occurring, King Bela of Hungary left Pest with an army of perhaps 60,000 men to confront what was now the united and larger Mongol force. The Hungarians advanced to find the Mongols on the plain of Mohi near the Sayo River. This battle took place over a bridge, with the Christians taking and holding it on both sides, where they circled their supply wagons as a defensive wall. But Subutai took 30,000 horsemen over a ford lower down the river and appeared in the rear of the Christian position, rendering them encircled. One side was left unoccupied, and sure enough the whole Christian army panicked and tried to flee in this direction, completely disorganized and vulnerable. It is estimated that some 40 to 50,000 of them were mercilessly slaughtered. The Grand Master of the Templars wrote to King Louis IX of France, reporting on the situation, stating that no Christian army of any significance now stood between the Mongols and his own kingdom of France. The prospect of a Mongol empire stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic suddenly appeared to be a realistic possibility. Then news arrived at the Mongol camps in Hungary of a great and accidental event that had occurred thousands of kilometers away in Mongolia. The great Khan Udagai had died, and all the leading and related leaders of the Mongol tribes were bound to make their way to Karakorum in all haste to participate in the installment of his successor. In Mongol eyes, the business of the conquest of Europe was a much smaller matter in comparison with such an event and its consequences. The horde withdrew to the steppes of South Russia. By the way, the word horde is pejorative in all the European languages, and derives directly from the Mongolian term for an encampment, orda. The Golden Horde and its successors, who converted to Islam, terrorized and bled Russia of tribute for centuries, only being extirpated by the Crimean Tartars, subject to the Turks, in 1502. What if the Great Khan had not happened to expire at Karakorum in late 1247? It seems highly probable that the European heartlands would eventually have been overrun by Batu's horde. Perhaps the density of stone fortifications would have slowed the process, but these had not stopped the Mongols in China or anywhere else. The cultural consequence may have been that Europe would have turned out more like Russia, with its delicate social balances and tensions shattered, its warrior elite for some centuries acting as the clients of the Mongols, and generally absorbing their political culture of admiration for pure power, no matter how tyrannical and sanguinary it was. On the streets of Russia today, Stalin is still held in high esteem by ordinary, decent Russians.
The search to find the greatest Russian in history. Over the past year, hundreds of thousands of votes have been cast, and with the poll due to close at the end of the month, there have been some surprising results. At the moment, top of the list is Alexander Nevsky, an early Russian hero who became a saint. In second place, perhaps the predictable favourite, Peter the Great. And in third, a name to surprise many outside of Russia, Joseph Stalin.
The petty power struggles within Christendom would probably have ceased for fear of the great, if distant, overlord. Europe would have experienced a prolonged setback in its economic development, being drained of wealth paid in tribute. Eventually, the Mongol yoke, as Russian historians call it, would finally have been lifted. But the political and cultural traditions of what is termed Oriental despotism would have remained embedded in Western Europe, giving its future evolution an altogether different direction. Why did the Grand Master of the Templars write to King Louis of France, to say that no serious politico-military obstacle lay between the Golden Horde and his then expanding feudal realm. This is because in the 1240s what lay between Hungary and the Kingdom of France was the Sanctum Imperium Romanum, the Holy Roman Empire. The word sanctum had been added by Emperor Fredericus Barbarossa a generation previously. This vast region of Central Europe was now nominally ruled by his grandson Fredericus II, King of Sicily. In 1232 this emperor had conceded to the prince-bishops and lay territorial magnates of the empire in Germany the confirmation of the Statutum in Favorem Principum, statute in favor of the princes, which effectively legalized their veto over any future imperial legislation and gave them all the realities of sovereignty in their principalities as terrae domini, territorial lords. From then on throughout history, the emperorship north of the Alps was to remain essentially an office of high prestige, a supreme court of appeal, the Reichshofgericht, and formal assembly of the political community of the empire, the Reichsdiet, or confederal parliament of the realm. Fredericus II made these concessions, which turned out to be permanent, because he had a political vision of the restoration of the Roman Empire in the West. He wanted to bring to a head the question of who ruled in Italy, the Pope, with his communal allies, the so-called Guelphs, or the office of the Roman Emperor, which he held, with his communal partisans, the Ghibellines. To achieve this, he needed to subjugate the northern Italian communes, such as Milan, Parma, and a host of other city republics, which effectively were independent powers. And then he needed to occupy Rome and install the imperial office once again in its place of origin, displacing the papacy to a partnership, but essentially a secondary role. He started his reign well. After swearing at one of his several coronations on the tomb of Charlemagne at Aachen that he would take the cross and recover the Holy Sepulchre for Christ, he eventually led an expedition to the Holy Land, where he had struck a tactical deal with the Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt for Christian suzerainty over Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem, and then had himself crowned king of the restored Kingdom of Jerusalem. That was in 1229. On his return from the East, he set about achieving his project for a real imperium in Italy, starting with the Regno, his personal realm, inherited from his French-speaking Norman Sicilian mother, Constance d'Hauteville, which was Sicily and southern Italy up as far as the Papal States. He promulgated a set of laws, the Liber Augustalis. As with Philippe Auguste of France, he too was laying claim to the mantle of the first Roman Emperor Augustus. This Book of Laws was a manifesto for a systematic centralized monarchy, as it was for a new regime of social order and lawfulness. It begins, lest one think that this was somehow a document of modern spirit and intention, with a forthright declaration of measures to be taken against heresy, de hereticis et paterenis, and apostasy, that is, converting from Christianity to Judaism or Islam, de apostatantibus. He explicitly forbids feuding between noble families, de guerra non movenda, and against the bearing of arms, de prohibita portatione armorum. There follows a series of measures for the physical protection of nuns, widows, wives, and young women, with drastic punishments for infractors, including de pena eius qui mulieri clamanti non succurret, the punishment for one who doesn't come to the aid of a screaming woman, which was 4 Augustales, a hefty fine. Fredericus was quite clear in his mind what the real content of imperial involved, what a state really should be. He alone would decide the laws without co-decision of any of his magnates. Ut nullus se intromittat de factis et consiliis regis, that none should interfere with the acts and decisions of the king. His titular style reflected his ambition eloquently. Imperator Fredericus Romanorum Caesar, semper Augustus Italicus Siculus Hierusolimitanus Alemanus, Felix Pius Victor et Triumphator. Emperor Fredericus, Caesar of the Romans, ever august, of Italy, Sicily, Jerusalem, and Germany, fortunate, pious victor, and triumphant. This was certainly order, to be imposed upon the chaos of the real social and political conditions of the time. But it was without interference in the exercise of a divinely ordained power. Others disagreed, including those who were ostensibly subjects of the emperor, such as the de facto independent city republics of the north of Italy. The rival to his claims of exclusive and universal sovereignty, the Papacy, disagreed very strongly also. The cities of Lombardy reformed their close alliance of the time of his grandfather, the Lega Lombarda, or Lombard League, which was a network of well-fortified cities, each capable of fielding a substantial military force. These aligned themselves with Pope Clement IV, determined never to see the Kingdom of Sicily be united with northern Italy, which would have encircled the Papal States, and eliminated it as an independent political actor. The war in Italy was tumultuously and cruelly fought. Cities rebelled and slaughtered their imperial garrisons. The emperor besieged and razed to the ground some of those which did so. A shipload of cardinals and bishops was captured and imprisoned at one point. The Pope convened a general council of the Church at Lyon within the territory of the Empire, that is, not in the Kingdom of France, and excommunicated Fredericus again and declared him deposed. It was in the midst of this tumultuous struggle for the future of Italy that the Mongols in Poland and Hungary wiped out several Christian armies which came against them. In 1241, Fredericus, already excommunicated, was approaching the gates of Rome with his army to physically intimidate the extremely aged Pope Gregorius IX, who at that moment died. Christendom's natural leaders, the Pope and the Emperor, in the hour of its greatest peril, were at each other's throats in central Italy. This was why the Grand Master of the Templars had written to the King of France in 1241, stating that no Christian force of any significance stood between the Mongol horde and his own kingdom. The Mongol probing squadrons began exploring the countryside around Vienna, their next target, and the gateway to Europe's heartland. The struggle reached its climax in February 1248, when Fredericus laid siege to the city of Parma. Fredericus built a surrounding fortified palisade, which he confidently named Vittoria, Victory. The Parman militia made a daring sortie while he was away hunting and destroyed the palisade, dispersing the imperial forces. Most damagingly, the imperial treasure chests, the sinews of war, were seized by the Parmans. The game was up. Fredericus could no longer finance his war and faced political defeat. Resistance spread to other cities when news of the disaster at Parma reached them. Still not defeated, Fredericus died of dysentery in 1250, at the age of 56. 4 years later, the Hohenstaufen dynasty was destroyed by its enemies, with his sons and grandson being captured and put out of the way. It was not until 1273, 2 decades later, that a new emperor could be legitimately elected by the German magnates, and his name was Rudolf von Habsburg, a name for the future. This war in Italy in the 1240s was the climax of the long struggle between the emperors and the papacy. We cannot yet say the German emperors, because Fredericus Hohenstaufen, the puer Apuliae, the Apulian child, grew up on the harbour front of Palermo and was hardly German. The papal imperial struggle had been going on for 2 centuries. Clearly, in 1250, the Roman pontificate was winning hands down. The fall of the House of Hohenstaufen in Italy meant that Germany would, from then on, remain a loose confederation of the greater territorial prince-bishops and princes, who would in time elect the emperor as they wished, and could easily ignore or defy his policies. The Sacrum Imperium Romanum, from now on incongruously confined to Central Europe north of the Alps, was frozen in an internal balance of power among its great princes, one that was to give it very long periods of stability and relative peace, while at the same time rendering it internally a lawless and petty feud-prone region, and externally it remained largely incapable of projecting political and military power. The centralized jurisdictional administrative state wished for by Frederikus II would never happen, not until the late 19th century. And when it finally did, under Bismarck, it was spurred by a consciousness of historical injury in Germany. They had failed to achieve a unitary state in the High Middle Ages, as they believed that France and England had. They had been left out, denied their rightful share of collective prestige, of prosperity, and of power. The formidable historians of 19th century Germany pointed back to this moment in 1250, when a corrupt and irreligious Roman Church had conspired to cheat Germany of its rightful future. The ideological influence of this historically informed, and falsely slow, national resentment was to contribute to the catastrophe that befell Europe in the first half of the 20th century. The Papacy could and did field its own armed forces during its struggles against the Hohenstaufen, but they were not very effective. To drive the heirs of Frederikus to extinction, his son Conrado and his grandson Conradino, a very formidable force was required. The Pope had it in his gift, it was widely accepted, to give this sovereignty over the Regno, that is Sicily and southern Italy, to whom he now wished. The highly ambitious younger brother of King Louis of France, Charles d'Anjou, was at Paris when the papal envoy offered him the crown of the Regno. This was a man who was at once pious and a voracious power-seeker. He was given the county of Anjou, from whence the name Angevin, by his brother the king, and had married into the lordships of Provence and Forcalquier, around Avignon. There he imposed a strict and exacting government, trampling on the customary freedoms of the cities, such as Nice, Grasse, Marseille, Arles, and Avignon. He imposed his resident officers, the viguiers, or superintendents. They appointed a committee of 6 from among the most prominent citizens, who in turn represented the will of the sovereign, when he chose to interfere, to the General Council and the people. Otherwise the city was left to rule itself. He insisted on all his seigneurial rights, most of them defunct or lapsed, and all possible tolls and dues. This led to armed revolts and a coalition of the Provençal cities, like the Lega Lombarda. Charles laid siege to Marseille and deprived the civic communes by force of their previous independence. As a sign of the times, he was keen to sell the old rights to the peasantry's servile labour obligations, and many villages came up with the money to buy them out, thus freeing themselves from this remnant of serfdom. Villages became self-governing, forming consulates, as they call them, to manage their own internal affairs. With this money and major loans from the Sienese banking house of Orlando Bonsignori, he brought a major army from France down into Italy in 1265. He crushed the last Hohenstaufen force at the Battle of Benevento. He then took over the Regno and established his clientele in Sicily, condemning to death 150 of the local barons who had supported the Hohenstaufen cause. Sicily had a laird upper class. The original Norman lords had, in the 1190s, accepted with difficulty the advent of the Hohenstaufen clientele from Germany. With the arrival of the French-speaking lords under Charles, serious tensions arose. The faction which supported the Hohenstaufen, the Ghibellines, still had much power and influence. They strongly resented Charles's measures and exactions. He, meanwhile, had barely settled into the palace at Palermo than he was looking to far wider horizons. In the east, the regime of Baudouin II, Imperator Romaniae, Emperor of Romania, the so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople, was crumbling. In 1204, when the great city fell to the Venetians and Frankish lords, the Greek-speaking Roman aristocracy had in large part fled across the Bosphorus to the Roman territories remaining in the northwest of Asia Minor, forming the so-called Empire of Nicaea. Baudouin was beleaguered and without a sufficient tax base. He was forced to strip the lead off the roofs of the complex of the great palace of the emperors in Constantinople, thereby ensuring their gradual ruin. Today, the Turkish authorities are making some efforts to excavate the site. The leading member of the remaining Roman aristocracy was Michael Palaiologos, who, because the Venetians were his mortal enemies, received strong support from the formidable navy of the Genoese. In July 1261, Constantinople was surrounded. The Roman general found an unguarded gate and entered and retook the city, expelling the Latins and their patriarch. The new Greek-speaking Roman emperor, crowned according to all the old ceremonial in Hagia Sophia, was Michael Palaiologos. This duo, the restored Greco-Roman dynasty of the Palaiologoi and the power of the city-state of Genoa, were to be the political content of the final 2 centuries of the Roman Empire at Constantinople. Emperor Michael's military means were sufficient to press hard upon the Villard-Douin dynasty in Achaea and other Latin counties, but they would have been no match for a great Latin lord like Charles d'Anjou. So Charles, from Palermo, schemed to ally himself with these Latin lords of Greece and the Aegean, and set off on a determined campaign to conquer Greece and Constantinople for himself, just as the Sicilian Normans had a century before. The accumulated diplomatic intelligence of the Constantinopolitan elite in many respects reminds us of that of the Roman Papacy. Michael Palaiologos suggested to King Pedro III of Aragon, at the other end of the Mediterranean, that the kingdom of Sicily could be his also if he acted. The Ghibelline faction in Sicily was secretly sounded out on the idea. Such was the fiscal and judicial pressure exerted by Charles's officers in Sicily that this project triggered an immensely powerful and cruel revolt on Easter Tuesday, the 31st of March, 1282, where 8,000 of Charles's men were massacred across Sicily. This, a century later, was dubbed the Sicilian Vespers, a name which has stuck. This was not, as Italian nationalism insists, a great popular national rising against foreign domination. There was no concept in the 1280s of a nation or of the unity of Italy in the modern sense. This revolt was that of a feudal and aristocratic faction, the Ghibellines, fighting to preserve themselves and their fiefs from the incursion of another powerful feudal interest. Aragon was a mountainous lordship inland from the coast of Catalonia, where the maritime city republic of Barcelona was a power unto itself, but in long-term symbiotic political union with Aragon. The prospect of a Mediterranean empire opened up before the elites of this hybrid kingdom. Pedro and the Catalan fleet was on crusade in Tunisia when the uprising happened. Soon Charles d'Anjou had returned to Sicily and was besieging Messina with his formidable force brought back from Greece. The Sicilian Ghibellines appealed to Pedro and offered him the suzerainty of the island. The Aragonese seized their opportunity and landed a large army in Sicily. There followed years of warfare between Charles and the King of Aragon, with Charles and his heirs holding Naples and Calabria, while the Aragonese and Barcelonans held Sicily. Both sides claimed the title of the Kingdom of Sicily. And so when, much later, the Aragonese finally won, the term the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies entered usage. The final result of the vacuum left by the fall of the Hohenstaufens in southern Italy was that it had been filled by the power of Aragon, thereby creating a maritime dominion of the Western Mediterranean, bringing the Catalan language and Iberian culture to southern Italy for centuries to come, a region which thereby switched its orientation from Germany to Western Spain. A new power had arisen in the Latin Occident. By the 1250s, even a brother of the King of France, like Charles d'Anjou, could command sufficient resources to become a major European power in his own right. What of the King of France himself? In the previous episode, we saw how the victories in Normandy in 1204 and at Bouvines in 1214 had transformed the fortunes of the Capetian dynasty. For 300 years they had been eking out a regal existence in their shrunken realm, no bigger than that of their senior vassals, and much smaller than that of their rivals the Plantagenets. During these centuries they had carefully cultivated their ideological resources. Nourished by the advice and the writings of the monks of the royal monastery of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, they had developed the ritual, symbolism and narrative of Carolingian royalty that inspired respect in their very powerful fellow dukes and counts. None of these had any such universalist pretensions. None of them thought to strike their own coins, that mark of sovereignty. The sacred oil of coronation, the title Rex Francorum, the symbol of the fleur-de-lis against a deep blue background, with which they draped themselves and their thrones, the heady title that was later to be bestowed on them by the popes for support against the Western emperors, that of Rex Christianissimus, Roi très chrétien, most Christian king, all combined with the passage of time to build the myth of royal legitimacy and sacrality. When in the early 1200s Philippe Auguste and his son Louis injected a string of major military successes into this rich ideological formulation, the combination of force and prestige became potent indeed. The claim of sovereignty implied in the Capetian ideology was that the whole of what had been the Carolingian West Francia was the natural sphere of feudal sovereignty of their direct heirs, the House of Capet. The spectacular conquests of the period 1204 to 1214 began for the first time to give that program the appearance of reality. Another great event almost immediately afterwards brought the Capetian ambition another massive step towards realization. This was the Cathar Heresy and the annexation of the County of Toulouse, to which it led. The Cathar Heresy was something quite new in Latin Christendom, a large-scale and very determined espousal of the new religion. The Orthodox Catholic Church, even before its establishment by Emperor Constantine and his successors, had always been vulnerable to theological contestation by high prelates and their clerical followers, who stressed this or that aspect of the Trinity and challenged the ecclesiastical unity and authority of the Orthodox bishops and patriarchs. But Catharism was different. It is believed that French-speaking crusaders returning through Constantinople picked up the new religion passing through the Balkans from Bulgarian Cathar refugees, hence the Bulgarian word to designate it, Bogomilism. That is Bulgarian for those dear to God. Its pedigree was Manichaeanism, the ancient dualistic cosmic explanation originating in Zoroastrian Persia. Good versus evil, the perfect against the damned, an absolute dualism without nuance or qualification. The whole fantastical business of three gods in one God, of the Mother of God, of the martyrs, patriarchs, saints and fathers, was all rendered irrelevant, as was the doctrinal and ecclesiastical authority of the Latin Church. There were other symptoms of serious challenge to the essentials of Christian authority. The Franciscan movement had been absorbed and rendered benign by the Church, But a radical strand, the Zelanti, or spirituals, insisted on the paramount value of poverty and turned this into a theology critical of the wealth and power of the Orthodox Church. Their descendants became known as the Fraticelli, or Little Brothers, who preached popular revolt against the Church. The Bogomil doctrine embedded itself in the counties of southern France, the Languedoc, and attracted fervent followers from all levels of society, even among the high aristocracy of the region. The Bogomils were declared to be heretics and were officially dubbed Patareni, and it was as Patareni that they were condemned as criminals in the opening articles of Fredericus's law code, the Liber Augustalis, mentioned previously. They were also known as the Cathars, presumably from the Greek katharoi, the pure ones. They were execrated and persecuted in the Eastern Empire, in the Balkans, and then in the Occident. Preaching against them accused them of sexual practices considered abominable. And so in the popular mind throughout the French-speaking lands they became known as the Bougres, from Bulgre, Bulgarian, which in turn became synonymous with sodomy. This entered the English language through the French spoken in England and shifted pronunciation to bugger, again meaning sodomite. Thus, today the popularly used term bugger, is a mild swear word, derives directly from the medieval sense of an execrated heretic. In 1208, Pope Innocent III sent his legate, Pierre de Castelnau, to discuss measures to counter the spread of the Cathar heresy in the dominions of Raymond, Count of Toulouse, the senior lord in the Languedoc. They had a violent disagreement, and the legate was subsequently murdered on his way back to Italy. Innocent responded by declaring a crusade to rid the Languedoc of heresy. This was an open incitement to any lord or knight to treat the whole Languedoc as a foreign land, a pagan land to be won for Christendom by force of arms. His call was answered by lesser lords and their knightly contingents. As usual, their motives were a potent mixture of religious outrage and the desire greatly to increase their own holdings of lands. Typical of this category were their leaders, Bouchard de Marly and Simon de Montfort, 1160 to 1218, whose son of the same name, 1208 to 1265, was to be the instigator of the First English Parliament. In July 1209, de Montfort led the crusading host from the duchies of the north of France into Languedoc to dispossess the heretical Comte de Toulouse and to eradicate Catharism. Thus began a terrible war of sieges and massacres lasting 20 years. Lords like Simon de Montfort, however, couldn't hold what they had taken. The family of the Counts of Toulouse and their supporters among the nobility of Languedoc, seeing their estates in peril at the hands of the invading northerners, continued to rally to the cause of the House of Toulouse. In 1214, both parties were near exhaustion. Pope Innocent III authorized Philippe II of France as the suzerain of the lands of the Count of Toulouse. In April 1216, de Montfort, seeking support in his struggle to establish himself, ceded to the King of France the lands he had conquered to be his vassal. In 1226, Philippe's son, now Louis VIII, led a second crusade into the south, this time as a full-scale royal invasion, taking town after town. These campaigns, to become known as the Albigensian Crusade after the town of Albi in that region, were terrible wars of extermination. For example, in 1209, the population of Béziers, both Cathar and Catholic, once the city had fallen, had been massacred in and around the church of La Madeleine. The sensational and ghastly events at the capture of Montségur, the last Cathar holdout to fall in March 1244, are the subject of many modern accounts. Some 240 men and women, who were finally forced to surrender but would not recant, were led to a fiery pit at the foot of the fortress mound and were, as used to be said, consigned to the flames. The persecution of the Cathars from that date was no longer deemed to be necessary as a full-scale enterprise. Louis VIII's heir was another Louis, the Ninth. He was then a child whose mother, Blanche de Castile, ruled in his name for 16 years. In 1229 she called off the military campaign in the Languedoc, having received the subjugation of the Counts of Toulouse. The net result, however, besides the extirpation of the Cathar movement, effectively was the annexation of Languedoc to the Capetian crown. Apart from the Duché de Bretagne, Brittany, the Comté de Flandre, Flanders, Bourgogne, and other smaller principalities, the Capetians had gone, in a mere 4 decades, from being preeminent in prestige in northern France to being preeminent in power throughout what had once been Carolingian West Francia. The France that we today assume has always existed was, by 1230, taking shape as a feudal realm. To end this episode, we turn once more, and for the last time, to the Terra Sancta, the Holy Land. Jerusalem had been lost after the disastrous battle at Hattin in 1187. It was temporarily brought under Christian administration through negotiation by Emperor Fredericus II in 1228, but it was retaken again by force of arms by the Ayyubids of Egypt in 1244. From then on, each stronghold and township of the European Levant was gradually whittled away. Caesarea and Haifa fell in 1265, the Principality of Antioch in 1268, Latakia in 1278, and then Tripoli in 1289. What T.E. Lawrence was in the early 20th century to call the greatest castle in the world, the Hospitaller Fortress on the Damascus Road, the Crac des Chevaliers, fell in 1271. Its ruined hulk stands today as witness to the scale of the effort that medieval Europe made over 200 years to make Palestine, Syria, its own. There remained the flourishing and populous Christian city of Saint-Jean d'Acre, headquarters of the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the orders of the Hospitallers of St. Thomas of Canterbury, and that of St. Lazarus. In the city also were communities from every part of Europe. Besides the substantial establishments of the military orders, the city was divided up between the colonies of the Pisans, the Genoese, and the Venetians, each with its own walled quarter, who competed fiercely against one another to monopolize the Levantine trade. The rivalry between these 3 maritime city-states was damaging. Venetian-Genoese enmity flared up continually. Open warfare broke out between them when the Genoese tried to secure for themselves the fortress monastery of San Saba at Acre. In June 1258, a galley fleet of Venice under Jacopo Tiepolo destroyed that of the Genoese under Roberto della Turca outside Acre, with the loss of 1,700 lives. Genoa responded by offering its naval and military power to the pretender Greek emperor, Michael Palaiologos. We have seen how Genoese support enabled the seizure of Constantinople by the Palaiologoi in 1261. In 1290, the Mamluk sultans of Cairo were looking for an opportune moment to snuff out the last Crusader presence in Palestine, Syria. They had taken the city of Tripoli the year before, and the local Genoese admiral had responded by killing some Muslim merchants. This incident was apologized for by the Genoese Senate and was forgiven. But in 1290 there was an altercation in Acre between some newly arrived Christians and Muslim merchants, said to have been fueled by drink on the Christian side, and serious crimes were committed. The relatives of those killed and wounded displayed their blood-stained clothes in the great mosque at Cairo. This was enough for the Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil. The preaching of the muftis at Friday prayers was cranked up to a paroxysm of hatred against the miscreants. The Amir Baibars al-Mansuri wrote, quote, "My soul had a strong desire for jihad, a desire for it like the earth thirsts for delivering rain." End quote. A call went out from the mosques for guzat, volunteers, those who fight alongside the Prophet, and thousands came forward. For Acre was an infidel city and a rich one. The siege began on the 5th of April 1291 and saw several daring sorties by the Templars, Hospitallers and other orders, which had little effect on the huge host assembled. The siege was a business of the steady firing of great catapults against the city's walls and towers, the great tower of the Hospitallers being known as La Tour Maudite, the Cursed Tower. It and the walls finally collapsed, and the Saracens surged in. The chronicler, an eyewitness, describes it. Quote, "Before dawn the next day, Friday the 18th of May, a drum began a powerful stroke, and at the sound of this drum, which had a horrible and mighty voice, the Saracens assailed the city from all sides." End quote. There was desperate street fighting, with small groups of the military orders fighting to the death in the city squares. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jean de Villars, took a javelin under the arm and died slowly amid the mayhem. One by one in the days that followed, the remaining fortress towers of the orders surrendered. The Hospitallers won, the Teutonic Knights, then finally the Templars. When the Templars agreed terms and opened the door of their tower and allowed the besiegers swarm in, these, in keeping with their ideas about warfare and the status of women prisoners, began to seize hold of the women and children as slaves. The Templars, imbued, I think, with the chivalric sensibility regarding the protection of women, were instantly enraged and took up the fight again, pointlessly. One massacre was answered by another. When the last Templars finally came out to surrender, their tower was so battered that it collapsed into a pile of rubble and dust behind them. Sylvia Shine tells us of the attitude to these events back in Europe. Quote, "The loss of Acre and of the Holy Land was regarded as a sad but ephemeral episode, a temporary setback, transient chastisement to propitiate the divinity. It was generally believed and expected that the situation would soon be reversed. Acre's wealthy and densely populated capital was one of the most famous cities in Christendom." End quote. The extinguishing of the last Christian stronghold in mainland Levant saw the further Islamization of the Near East. For those Christian communities indigenous to the Near East for centuries before the arrival of Islam, for the Armenians, the Syrians and Lebanese, for those in Palestine and for the Coptic Christians, the extinguishing of the crusading presence in the Levant meant the final closing off of a possible future. From then on, they would always remain vulnerable minorities living under social pressure and subject, down the centuries, to the sporadic violence of the holders of power or of extremists within the surrounding Muslim community, as they are still today. Although most people in Latin Christendom could not bring themselves to believe it at the time, the fall of Acre marked the definitive end of the European presence in the Near East, that is, until 1917. The whole crusading enterprise to re-Christianize the central location of the Christian understanding of the cosmos had begun in 1095 and had lasted just 200 years, coming to this calamitous end in the dust and blood of Acre in 1291. For the following 400 years, Islamic power was to be in the ascendant, and Europe was to be on the defensive.